Maybe I'm just a bit of a history buff, but I've long been fascinated to hear the origin stories of the original international schools. So many of them had very humble beginnings with a handful of students, a few parents, usually spouses of diplomats or business people who had moved overseas, and a large house or a few rooms where lessons could be held. At 71 years of age, the Lincoln School in Kathmandu, Nepal, is one such school. In this case study style interview, we were lucky enough to be able to speak with Barbara Butterworth, who was head of the school from 1998 to 2005. Barbara began her time in Nepal as a Peace Corps volunteer. She then went on to become the principal or director of 4 different schools in Nepal, Lincoln being one of them. Clearly, Nepal has a special place in Barbara's heart. Even now, not having lived here full time for many years, Barbara comes back every year to spend several weeks in Kathmandu, reconnecting with her beloved adoptive country. You'll find Barbara's full bio in our show notes. Barbara shared some stories and perspectives and really helped us to understand what makes the Lincoln School special. Our guiding question for the episode was, at 70 years of age, Lincoln School is one of the OG international schools. How did Lincoln School get its start, and what makes the school and its community a special place to be? Here are a few of the topics covered in this episode. Lived values and characteristics of Lincoln School and its community. The origin story of the school, comparing to similar early international schools. How the Lincoln School and community dealt with struggles and difficult times. How some international schools celebrate their milestone anniversaries. And recruiting during pre-internet times. This show was recorded on February 10th, 2025. Prepare to journey back through time through Barbara's stories of her extraordinary experiences living in Nepal.
Well, hello, Barbara. We are really looking forward to this episode. It's kind of a historic episode as we trace the timeline of some of your experiences. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
And we always say, where in the world are you? So where are you?
At this moment, I'm in Patan in Nepal, sitting in a tiny apartment.
Excellent. Well, that made our timing work well because Audrey's not that far away and I'm
right
in Southeast Asia. So that timing is always helpful. And thank you again for joining us. So do you have a going global story for us?
Well, since I've been going global for a long time, there are quite a few. But I guess that it all began going global when I was a Peace Corps volunteer assigned to Nepal and assigned to a town not far outside the Kathmandu Valley called Banepa. I went there to teach math, science in the high school. And during that time, I had a group of very, seeming to me, precocious 6th and 7th graders. And I ran special classes for them because they actually asked questions. Most kids sat there like a lump on the log. So I did special things with this group. And over time, I've come back to Nepal regularly and stayed in touch with them. And now, some 58 years later, these former students are good friends. And 38 years ago, we established a scholarship program to raise scholarship monies for both the school that they went to and that I taught in, and schools in that area. And so we've been supporting 120 kids a year in school. And the way we raise the money is something that we experienced the other day, and that is we hold a walk, eat, and do good. So we gather everyone we can find to do a serious hike up a hill. At the top of the hill, the Banepa Mother Women's Group has cooked us an unbelievable feast of Newari food. I mean, the spread just goes on and on. Lots of the wine they make and beer, and then we dance and have a very good time, and people contribute as part of that. So that was our big fundraising event. And the incredible thing for those of you who work in international education internationally is the many connections you make. And at that event, there were connections from all different parts of our lives in Nepal, and they all come together in a very powerful and meaningful way.
Yes, and I met some very interesting people on that walk, including Barbara herself. So I'm thrilled that you're here, Barbara. Thank you. So we're kind of curious about how Lincoln School, of which you were also the head for a number of years, got its start. And think of this kind of as a case study for our listeners to better understand the history of international schools in general. And Many international schools build sort of a certain profile around their values, characteristics, and tendencies. And so we want to help our listeners better understand how the birth and growth process of some of these international schools unfold. So here's our guiding question for you, and then we'll get into some supporting questions. We're being teachers here. At 70 years of age, Lincoln is one of the OG international schools. How did Lincoln get its start, and what makes the school and its community a special place to be? So, diving into our first more specific question, what first brought you to Lincoln School, and what were some lived values and characteristics of the school that interested you?
Well, actually, I have a very unusual history with Lincoln School because I was working on a USAID project in the early 70s, and I joined the board at that time. And I knew a number of people at the school, so there were many teachers who were former Peace Corps volunteers. It was a very small school back then. And then I was back in the late 80s, also working on a USAID, as a contractor. And again, I joined the board. And at that time, it had grown, and we were getting ready to graduate our first high school, first 12th grade. And I was the first commencement speaker. So that was the background to eventually, in 1998, becoming the director of the school. So my path to international education, I would say, is quite unusual as compared to how most people get into it. And I think that what has always appealed to me about the school, other than it being in Nepal, because my primary background and experience is being in Nepal, not being in international education. And so the chance to be back, the chance to work with a group of expats in an environment that I valued and would have more control over, and where we could make our own decisions and create the kind of education we wanted to create, was very appealing because I'd spent many, many years trying to work with the Nepali education system. And that's an interesting but real challenge. And so the idea of being able to be in Nepal and create really exciting educational opportunities was exciting. Also, it's a small school, and as we've noted elsewhere, it's a school that is a very tight-knit community. And it's a community that values their presence in Nepal and just creates lasting connections. And as we mentioned earlier, one of the positives about international life is those strong connections that are created as you work overseas, almost in whatever capacity. International schools are just one example. There's the aid community that moves around very much the same way the international teachers move around. So there are a lot of similarities there. So that's how I came to Lincoln.
That's so interesting that you sort of came into it sideways, we might say, where you were already here, a board member, already had that affiliation, and then became the head of school. That's so interesting. Thank you for that.
What's catching my interest here, and we had Leanne Lavender on recently talking about service to the community and developing global citizenship. I'm kind of seeing the angle where a portion of the teaching community, probably like your case, people on the board, were in Nepal to do good, to make a difference. Mm-hmm. So they went from the community into the school, which to me would strengthen those ties and just make it a natural part of the school, just as you noted, to be very community-based. Mm-hmm. What an interesting story that I think a handful of probably other schools around the world had similar ways of getting their start. So talking about getting their start, what can you tell us about the early days in how Lincoln School took its first steps?
Well, in 1954, the precursor to USAID, which I believe was USOM, started work in Nepal. And they started work in Ravi Bhawan, which was a huge old Rana palace right down the street from where the school is right now. That has unfortunately been demolished, so you won't get to see it, Audrey, but it was quite an edifice. And of course, families came, and they had kids, and they needed to go to school. And so in Ravi Bhawan, I think there were some mothers who were perhaps teachers, and they started a very small kind of, quote, school. And I think over the years, gradually that grew. Basically, though, I think it served only USAID families because the U.S. Embassy wasn't established here until 1961. And it was always located, for a long, long time, it was located at Ravi Bhawan. And I think it was primarily American women, mothers, and American kids. Over time, of course, that has changed and it has grown substantially. I think it was in about 1963, 64 that the school moved to its present site, which is just down the street from where Robbie Bowen was. And since then, it has bit by bit grown and grown and grown until now what you see is, instead of little buildings and little grass shelters and things like that, it's a major institution now that exists on the site. But I think that, again, the beginnings hearken to that idea of depth in the community. The people were here working with aid. They were committed to working with Nepalis, improving the life of people here. And that suffused what everybody did. When you look at a few of the early pictures, the kids were out trekking, they were out exploring the market, they were very much integrated. The local community was very much a part of what their education was all about. And I think that has stayed with the school as it has grown over time. And the other piece of that, as you mentioned, David, is people in the community continued to kind of feed into the school as they hired local hire teachers who had been here a long time, not just wives of embassy employees, but people who had been living here a long time. We had a number of people working in aid programs, say with CARE, with USAID, and other places that had been here a very long time. And their kids came to the school. They served on the board. So they brought, and I was very grateful for this because we went through some very tough times. They brought an experience and a depth of knowledge about Nepal that made it much easier to be here. We also were fortunate to have some teachers who had been there a very long time, and they brought the history and the connections to the broader community, and so that stayed with the school. And I feel like that's also a very important part of what has been the history of Lincoln.
And you mentioned CARE, which was in my head with the United Nations and their efforts to support communities around the world. So historically, I'm guessing the children of those workers in time led to a more international flavor to the school. Am I thinking correctly?
Yes, I think so. There was the UN. The British had a school, but there were not schools for Japanese, Korean, other aid organizations that were working here. So we often served as their school. And over time, that's just expanded. And then we've always had a fair number of Nepali students. When I was there, about a third of the students, I'm not sure right now. I was committed at that time to making sure we had Nepali students and also expats who lived here long term but could not afford the high tuition. So we had a scholarship program that would help bring in the diversity of our community. So it wasn't just international embassy people, that made up our community. It was a much more diverse community.
They do still have Connect clubs that have the mandate, if you will, of reaching out and working with community partners. And in particular, one that I was told about yesterday helps to sponsor a local school that was created for street kids. And it houses them and also, gives them an education, and they remain connected to the school. And it's just a wonderful cultural.
And that's been a long-term connection that we've had.
Yeah. And the fact that it's ongoing, even though that was quite a number of years ago that those things were in place, is really, whenever there's a legacy at one of these international schools that lives beyond teachers that tend to come and go, the international teachers, it's such a wonderful thing. So in your time, you talked a little bit about how there are some challenges working with the local government and getting programs in place. What are some examples of possible barriers that you need to have in place so that schools can keep going, especially during difficult times?
Well, let me just say that our difficult times that we experienced that I'll be reflecting on was the period of the Maoist insurgency in Nepal here, which culminated in about 2006 with the overthrow of the monarchy. That was a particularly difficult time. It was difficult because there were strikes all the time. You never knew when school was going to be closed. Bombs were being set off about town. When was it safe to bring kids to school? We sometimes had them in school and we couldn't send them home. I felt like I really wasn't running an educational organization for a long time. I was just, the head security officer someplace. So I think at that time, and that's the only one I can really talk about, one of the things is we had strong embassy support. We had to make decisions about safety. The regional security officer was terrific. He was there at the phone anytime I called and said, "Tell me, how are things going?" And the administrative officer was very helpful. I felt like there was flexibility at the embassy to help support us in meeting our needs, and that was terrific. And the other thing that I mentioned earlier is the resiliency and support of the community. You know, as I said, we had Nepalis in the school, we had longer-term expats in the school, people experienced in aid projects in the school, so they could bring a perspective and an understanding of what was happening. And it meant less panic, I think, and less, with the understanding, everybody could be a little bit calmer about everything that was going on, which was really pretty challenging for a while. So I would say, again, depth of contacts within the community made it possible, really to survive, both in terms of experienced teachers, parents, and a diversity of students that came from all parts of the community.
So let me expand on that a little bit. So for our listeners who have not gone overseas yet, and we talk about the birth of a school, there are certain stages that they go through to build kind of that foundation, I guess you would say. And one of the big ones is accreditation. Mm-hmm. And then other ones are building systems in place, the finance system, the transportation system, if you've got
God, yes.
buses. And under the finance, one of the schools I was at had some financial trouble, some shenanigans. So they had to get a system that any check that went out had to be signed by the head of the school and the finance director. So there are a lot of things that have to go in place to show that community that we're speaking about here, that you are the real deal and that you can be counted on. And then in this case study, to be ready for crisis situations. Do you have a crisis management plan? Because what happens, and I can speak to like when I was in Hong Kong and we had SARS, boy, the community turns towards the school for help. And you need to have that. And here's another truism. You need to have one single voice from that school because a lot of times there's misinformation. This is, the days before conspiracy theories on the internet and all that stuff. But one communicator and a plan that you can show your stakeholders that you've got things under control as best you can. So there are a lot of different things that go into place. And then with these struggles that come up, to be able to come through it and keep to your mission, keep to your values, and go forth. So I want to add that, kind of expand the discussion. Or did you want to add anything from your experience with kind of the growth of some of the schools you've worked at?
Well, I'll just echo what you said, that when we were in Ethiopia and the coup was happening, we looked to the embassy, but also as teachers, we looked to the school to tell us what was going on, to take care of us, and so on. And similarly in Riyadh, we had the regional security officer who was briefing us all the time, but at school. And it always came down to what was the school going to do? How were they going to take care of us? How are they going to reassure everybody in crisis and so on? So it does play a pivotal role. Barbara, go ahead.
I was just going to add that another crisis management that is important here in Nepal is preparation for earthquakes. We're in a very active earthquake zone.
Yes.
Again, the importance of making the community feel comfortable and know we were prepared. We had regular earthquake drills where we had fake injuries, lost kids, set up tents, set up triage centers. And so that I think everybody felt comfortable knowing what our role was in the school. We also stockpiled lots of food so we could be prepared for up to 4 or 5 days of feeding people on site and feeding some of the community on site because, if there was a real disaster of an earthquake, our place had open space and it was a place where people could go. And again, I think it was, we communicated that plan to our community. So parents felt comfortable that they knew their kids in case of an emergent, like an earthquake, or even bombs going off around town and you have to keep kids at school. They knew what we were prepared to do to take care of them. We had a very carefully developed system for tracking kids coming and going, where they went, who went with them. so that if kids left the campus, not with parents, we could tell them who they left with, all of that kind of thing. So it was a fairly elaborate process to develop plans like that, but I think it's very important for the community to feel that sense of security.
Oh, that sounds like some fantastic contingency planning. I'm very impressed that you did the fake injuries and
Oh, yeah.
stockpiling of food. That was very
Search and
thorough.
rescue, the whole thing.
Impressive, impressive. And to consider the surrounding community as well. Fantastic.
So what's jumping out at me again for our listeners is in our world of supposedly 13,000 plus international schools, that there are not as many ones that are supported by the embassy like the Lincoln School.
That's right.
Especially these for-profit schools that are coming up. And we're really hearing the story of how important that is. And I've been at a few of the schools that have the embassy support, and it really makes a difference. And then you get the State Department, the American State Department, that also is out there working with American international schools. So, folks, this is not the norm. It's really these older schools that have this kind of support. So take that in. All right, let's get into celebration mode. And we're talking about the age of the Lincoln School. So you were there during the 50th year. I guess now it's around the 71st year of the school. So could you share some highlights from that celebration? And then what are some of the benefits of celebrations that international schools do? Because I've been at a few, again, that especially these 10-year anniversaries, 20, 30, 30th, that they do. So first, what were some highlights from the 50th, and what are some general benefits from taking the time to celebrate?
Well, this is going to be brief because I don't remember that well. This was 20 plus years ago. And I know we spent a lot of time. We started at least 6 months ahead of time preparing for it. You saw the slideshow. I sent Audrey a slideshow we put together of the history of the school. We tried to round up as many alums as we could. And it turns out there are quite a few alums here in Nepal because we had a fair number of Nepali students. We had a number of expats who stayed on to run orphanages or other kinds of things. And so we spent a lot of time trying to find these old alums and have them come to the event, which was really quite special. And so we had one evening of entertainment and stories and speeches and all of that kind of thing. And I know we had exhibits up about the history of the school and some things like that. But beyond that, I honestly don't remember much of the details about it. Thinking about what's the benefit of it is that, and I think as a result of that, bringing alumni into the school is really important. And we focused more and more on trying to do that. We established informally kind of a way for alumni to communicate with each other. The school, I think, has continued to reach out and have alumni days where alums are encouraged to come back. At least I think that's happening. I'm not sure. And so that, I think, was one of the big benefits, was to kind of celebrate that history and the continuity we had, again, with being here in Nepal.
And that makes me think of Nido in Chile, that had a very interesting start dealing with the outdoors and the connections to nature. And I could see maybe when they did their celebrations, bringing those alumni back that rekindle those early days and the importance of those values. And there's so many values you're talking about for Lincoln that jump out at me. And that way you work with the current students to say you're stewards of this and you need to continue this and don't let it go. So I did want to add my 2 cents, and maybe I'm being too opinionated, but I've been at a couple schools that I've gone through this, and I'm a huge believer in celebrating people and events. And at one school, a lot of money was spent on mugs and T-shirts and a helicopter coming in, taking a picture of all of us. And I thought all that was very interesting, but I did pause and go, what are we doing to reflect? How are we making this a learning opportunity from the students to the teachers to the board to the parents? How are we reflecting about getting back to that mission, about where we are right now, and how are we going to keep that mission going? But also, do we need to reinvent ourselves a little bit? Do we need to look at the pathway. Our times have changed. What do we need to do differently? So I wanted to add that in as schools do celebrations. So I'm hoping that reflective process is a norm for a lot of schools. I don't know, Audrey, do you have a take on this?
I've certainly been present when, I was at Singapore American School when they hit their 50th. There were quite a few alumni who came back, expat alumni who flew in, and, we had presentations and so on. So I can remember the bleachers being full of alumni, but still, I really like the community piece. I don't know the extent to which that part was there. We didn't really have that many Singaporean students. So I've been part of it. I don't know that I've seen one that was quite so extensively involved in bringing the alumni in directly, and the community connections, and really certainly reconnecting with the mission was always part of it. And things like a slideshow of the origin story and so on. I just really enjoyed your description, Barbara, of the extent to which so many alumni were still there.
Mhm.
That was really cool. That really would bring it back to life, because there they are to give their testimonial.
Mhm.
My next question is to ask you about kind of the region. And one thing with Mark teaching at Lincoln now that I'm aware of, because he's coaching track and they're off to Oman tomorrow. So that really piqued my interest, because they're in a athletic league with, and, cultural connection league with Oman and with Chennai, India, and I think maybe Delhi, and maybe you can help me out, Barbara, but it's kind of a bit of a sprawling league. And so tell us some stories, and maybe you can piggyback on how that athletic SISA came together and some stories about the community at large.
Okay. Well, SISA preceded me, so I can't tell you the origins, but Lincoln is a small school, and we're in a community that's not a big city like Delhi or Dhaka with all kinds of resources and museums and all kinds of things. So I think athletics are and have become a really important part of our identity as a school. We have a big, beautiful gym. It was built before everything else in the school. The school gym has been around forever, and it is. Well, I haven't seen a lot of other ones, but it's a really nice building. And so that kind of also captured the idea, okay, athletics are important here. It's one thing that kids can do after school that brings us together. And the other thing is we did well. We were one of the smallest groups, and our group was Delhi, Dhaka, Sri Lanka, Karachi, Islamabad. That may have been it then. And I know it's expanded since then and changed. Because Delhi was always so big, these big schools thought, oh, they don't want to be in a league with us small schools. Lincoln is a mini school by comparison, but we would beat them. So, we'd come out on top. And more often than not, and we'd also win the sportsmanship award. Time and time again, our kids won that award. They'd win first place and they'd win that award, which was really unusual. So I think athletics played an especially important role in bringing out the community. The younger kids, we would do pep rallies. They were the leaping leopards who were the cheerleaders. So the young kids would come to the games. All the families would come to the games when they were here. And it was a really big deal for us because that was the one, outside connection we had. As to stories, I think, well, there are always problems everywhere, but getting travel. But it was interesting. The heads of the schools would get together once a year and plan the calendar for athletic events, music, art competitions. We had a few of those. I don't know how many they're doing now. I'm sure a lot. But because people in Pakistan couldn't travel to India, travel was very difficult. We would either go to Thailand to meet or we'd go to Abu Dhabi to meet. And that's where we had to have our annual meeting. So that suggests some of the challenges of traveling in our particular conference at that time.
Yeah, Mark is taking the track team to Oman, and the Pakistanis are not allowed to go there. One, I guess, young man was able to get special dispensation, but his dad had to call in a favor. I don't even know, but
Yeah.
That's a factor that certainly weighs in. Like when we were in Riyadh, nobody could come in, so we never were the host of any of the international school competitions. We were always traveling out. So that's another. But to your point about how big a piece athletic plays, I think that tradition has continued as you know, with Luke Davis being the former student who is now the head of athletics. It's very, especially swimming. Swimming seems to be quite a huge thing. And, there's a student Danish student, I think,
Yes, I
he's
know,
Jana's
Jana's
son,
daughter.
who is on the national team and
Mhm.
this type of level of competition. So, yeah, I think it is a big piece still. And we did have an AD on to interview. And so people did get a bit of a flavor of what these international sports leagues are like. But again, anybody who's just thinking about going international, it's the coolest thing to be able to travel to these other countries
Mhm.
as a coach and have your kids compete in these athletic events with people who are coming from a broad range of countries. It's
Mhm.
a fabulous piece of the tradition of these international schools.
So let's go back in history again, and this time on the recruiting front. When I was sitting and thinking about these questions, I was smiling, and maybe Audrey, you might be smiling as well. When we were hired, for example, at Saudi Arabia International School, now renamed, and just how slow the process was, much different than it is now. So, Barbara, could you kind of give an overview what it was like to recruit for Lincoln, and maybe even earlier stories that you heard about how that process worked and maybe didn't work?
Well, it was changing as I was there because emails were coming in. There was started to be a much more drawn out, people submitting applications, all kinds of things, reviewing them, hiring people before conferences. But that was towards the end. Basically, you hired everybody at either the ISS fair or the search conference. And at that point, they were mostly in the US. They've since, branched out and they're more regionally. So it would be this incredible nonstop few weeks that I'd head off to the States. And I mean, you've been to recruiting fairs. You know what a what a crazy process it is trying to interview people, call references, and it's who knows what time of night it is when you're trying to reach people, making decisions, and that person says, well, oh, I've already got another offer, let me think about it, and then you have to wait, and then you lose somebody else, and it's just it was a mind-boggling, competitive kind of process. And especially, we would talk about Nepal because the other challenge was to help people be realistic about Nepal. Nepal has this image, there's the Himalayas and this beautiful, magical kingdom and stuff. Well, it is that, but it's also a lot of other things that make living here difficult. At the time when I was there, we had electrical outages all the time for hours at a time. The Maoist insurgency's going on. You've got bombs going off around town. It's dirty. The water is not clean. I mean, there was a lot of things about living here that were a challenge. And my challenge always was to have a slideshow to promote the school that would give a balance of life. So when people arrived, they didn't just arrive with their ice axes expecting to, go trekking in these beautiful hills and not much else all the time. So that was another big challenge that we faced. But I mean, a lot of people wanted to come to Nepal, so it wasn't impossible to recruit. We were a small school and it was a warm and welcoming place. And so it made, I think, recruiting, I felt like I got some very good teachers as a result, but it was just a crazy couple of days. As a matter of fact, it was the first time I bought a cell phone because when you try to call references, first of all, if you call on a hotel phone, they charge you an arm and a leg for international calls. I said, this is ridiculous. So I was in Boston for a search fair, and I said, I've got to get a cell phone. So I went out, bought that cell phone. It was in Boston, the 617 number. I still have the 617 number that reminds me of that recruiting event. So.
Yeah, well, that really does take me back down memory lane. The early experiences that I'm sure David also shares. David, do you want to add something?
And again, Audrey, you might want to speak to this with Ethiopia. My first job, 1990, was in Israel, and it was before the Gulf War and the invasion of Kuwait. But Israel was a place that people worried about. There was definitely terrorist activities and such. And after I started working there, and Forrest Broman was our head of school, I remember asking him, we were out having a drink one night, and I said, well, tell me about how do you hire people? What's your thinking? And he said, I don't really so hire for the position. I hire the person. I've got to hire people who are willing to take some risks. They're problem solvers. They're adaptable. They're all the things we talk about international educators in general, but to a factor, a much higher factor, because you got to be able to. And then the invasion took place and the Scuds came in. And if I remember correctly, no one left. So he had hired a group of people that were ready for that struggle. So I'm thinking the same thing towards Kathmandu, that certain kind of hiring of people first. Let's get that position. That's going to be important, but I've got to hire people who can handle that. Does that make sense to you, Barbara?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, that does also ring a bell with our interview with Tim Stewart, who was talking about schools in Africa and how people self-select to a certain extent, that, they're open to adventure, but they're also open to things maybe not being so easy. And they're certainly open to, this is not Kansas anymore, Dorothy, type of thinking, where you can't just freak out because the electricity goes off, like you said, Barbara. That was definitely my experience in Addis, where it was almost a daily thing. It wasn't with the electricity go off, it was when with the electricity or the water,
Mm-hmm.
So I admire the transparency of directors when they're hiring. I also agree with you that it's essential, because you can't have people come and freak out at the first small thing and take off, because it is, as you say, it's not always easy to hire people for some of these more perhaps difficult living situations. And so hiring people who do come across as resilient and open-minded and kind of up for anything is essential. So thank you very much for everything you shared. It so far has been a fun visit.
My pleasure. It's been lovely.
I'm wondering if there's anything else you'd like to share that's coming to mind.
I just share one other activity we did. I think it still goes on in some form, I'm not sure, but it built on the beginning of the school, where the kids would go out and explore their environment and everything. For a long time, every year, the upper grades, everyone would go trekking. And that got people out into, and the older kids went further afield. They go off for a week, 8 or 9 days, really to all different parts of Nepal. This was back before the Maoist insurgency, and it was safe pretty much to trek anywhere. So trekking 6th grade and up, or 5th grade and up, was kind of at the core of Lincoln School for years and years. When I was there, partly because of the Maoist problem, and we couldn't trek as freely, and also kids got tired of trekking. They were interested in other things. We started something called Explore Nepal Week, and each grade had a different kind of activity. So over the course of 6 years, there'd be lots of different ways kids had experienced Nepal. So I think 6th graders went trekking, 7th graders explored the arts. They would apprentice to a potter or a brass maker or something like that for the week and learn how to do it. We had, I think, 9th grade built biogas plants. 10th grade worked with Habitat for Humanity. 11th grade was sports. They did a bicycle trip. And then 12th grade was outdoor leadership, so that if a child was there over time, they really had a really varied experiences with Nepal. And that was building on that initial kind of idea that Nepal is our world, and we need to be out there exploring it.
That's fantastic. I love the apprenticeship piece as well.
Oh, it was quite remarkable.
Yeah, that's something akin to what we were talking about with the whole service learning and community partner piece with Leanne Lavender as well. And it's great to hear that that's been going on for a long time. So quite an exemplary kind of school in a lot of ways. Yeah. David, anything else you want to?
I'm thinking of our mission, Audrey, is to inform and teach folks about international life, and folks that are already there, bringing on people that can tell stories, ways to inform them about how international life is changing. And Barbara, I've really, really enjoyed this show, because a lot of us in the field are Rolling Stones. And to hear from someone who came to international education out of service, and the willingness to get on that plane and go to Nepal and then make that a part of your life, for your adult life. I just have such respect for that. And it's just a reminder that some international educators do make one place their home for a long time and do integrate with the local community and provide ways to be of service. So thank you for sharing your overall story and then some smaller stories that make the Lincoln School, and I've been to Kathmandu, just such a fascinating place. So again, thank you, Barbara.
You're very welcome. It was lots of fun. It was fun to reflect and try to remember some of those experiences and times.
Yeah, thank you. I think a lot of people are now going to be lined up to come and work at Lincoln School. So thank you again. Take care.
Thank you for joining us today on Educators Going Global.
You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Music, and all the other usual suspects.
Please subscribe, like us, and leave a review on Apple and Spotify, and let your teaching friends know about us so we can grow our community.
Please reach out at educatorsgoingglobal@gmail.com and join our Facebook group, Educators Going Global, if you have ideas, comments, or wish to share a Going Global story of your own.
You can also find us on Instagram at Educators Going Global.
Please visit our website as well, www.educatorsgoingglobal.com. All our podcast episodes are on there by topic, along with blog posts, Going Global stories, and our ever-growing resource library. For now, this is Audrey
And David.
inviting you to travel,
Teach.
and connect with us.